James Langston, a dedicated black police chief, returns from vacation feeling at peace, until a sudden incident on the road forces him into a brutal confrontation with his own officers. Attacked, abandoned, and left with nothing, Langston must find the strength to return and confront the traitors. Will he be able to bring them to justice and restore faith in the police force? The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple as Police Chief James Langston guided his sedan along the winding highway. The peaceful scenery before him was a fitting end to what had been his first real vacation in 5 years. After 23 years in law enforcement, 15 of them climbing the ranks to become the first black police chief in Cedar Grove, he had finally allowed himself the luxury of a week away from it all. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibilities, empty save for the occasional passing car. Langston adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, feeling the lingering relaxation from his beach vacation in his muscles. The radio hummed softly, playing an old jazz tune that reminded him of his father, another man who had worn the badge with pride in more difficult times. "You've got to be twice as good to get half as far," his father used to say. Those words had been both a burden and a motivation throughout Langston's career. He had carried them through the police academy, where he graduated top of his class, through his years as a beat cop, and finally to the chief's office. Each step had been a testament to his father's wisdom and a challenge to the system that made such wisdom necessary. The memory brought a slight smile to his weathered face. At 52, Langston had earned every line that creased his dark skin, each one telling a story of battles fought and barriers broken. His short-cropped hair had begun graying at the temples, lending him what his wife called a distinguished look, though he preferred to think of it as evidence of survival. As he rounded a gentle curve, his thoughts drifted to the changes he'd implemented in his department over the past 3 years. Community outreach programs, de-escalation training, accountability measures, small steps toward the larger goal of building trust between law enforcement and the community they served. It hadn't been easy. Change never was, especially in a profession as steeped in tradition as police work. The dashboard clock read 6:47 p.m. He'd be home in time for dinner with Sarah. His wife had texted earlier about making his favorite pot roast, a welcome home gesture that made him realize just how much he'd missed home cooking during his vacation. A flash of movement in his rearview mirror caught his attention. A police cruiser appeared in the distance, weaving slightly between lanes. Langston's professional instincts, dulled by vacation but never truly dormant, sparked to life. Something about the car's movement seemed off. He eased his foot off the accelerator, allowing the cruiser to draw closer. Through the growing dusk, he could make out the number on the side, 247. Not one of his department's vehicles. This one was from the neighboring county. The cruiser's erratic movement became more pronounced as it approached, swerving dangerously close to the shoulder before jerking back into the lane. Langston's relaxed vacation mindset evaporated entirely, replaced by the sharp focus that had kept him alive through countless situations over the years. He watched as the cruiser drew closer, its headlights blazing unnecessarily in the twilight. Years of experience told him something wasn't right, and the peaceful evening was about to become anything but. His hand instinctively moved to his phone, considering whether to call it in. But to whom? This wasn't his jurisdiction, and something told him this situation needed a more immediate response. The cruiser was now close enough that he could see 2 figures in the front seat, their movements animated, almost aggressive. "Lord, give me strength," Langston muttered, a habit he'd picked up from his mother. He knew what he had to do. Even off-duty, even outside his jurisdiction, he was still a police officer. More than that, he was someone who had sworn to protect and serve, not just his community, but anyone who needed help. As he prepared to pull over and confront whatever situation was unfolding behind him, Langston couldn't have known that his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would test not only his physical courage but the very principles he'd spent a lifetime upholding. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway, as the peaceful evening transformed into something far more sinister. The jazz on the radio faded to static as Langston checked his mirrors one last time. In the growing darkness, the cruiser's erratic movements had become more pronounced, more threatening. Whatever was about to happen, He knew this wasn't going to be the quiet drive home he'd planned. His vacation was definitely over. The police cruiser lurched dangerously close to Langston's rear bumper, its headlights flooding his mirrors with harsh white light. Making a quick decision, he activated his hazard lights and gradually slowed his vehicle, pulling onto the broad shoulder of the highway. The cruiser followed, its wheels kicking up gravel as it came to an unsteady stop about 20 feet behind him. Through his rearview mirror, Langston observed two officers emerging from their vehicle. Their movements were uncoordinated, almost aggressive, a far cry from the practiced precision he'd spent years drilling into his own officers. The taller officer, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut, stumbled slightly as he approached the driver's side. His partner, shorter but stockier, flanked the passenger side of Langston's car, one hand resting unnecessarily on his holstered weapon. "Stay calm, stay professional," Langston muttered to himself, rolling down his window. The smell of alcohol hit him immediately, not from the officers themselves, but from what appeared to be open containers poorly concealed in their cruiser's cup holders. The situation was worse than he'd initially suspected. "Evening, officers," Langston said evenly, keeping both hands visible on the steering wheel, a habit born from both training and personal experience. "I'm concerned about the way you were operating your vehicle back there." The taller officer's face contorted into a sneer. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his words slightly slurred. His nameplate read Thompson. "I don't think that's necessary," Langston replied, maintaining his composed demeanor. "I'm Police Chief James Langston from Cedar Grove, and I'd like to have a professional conversation about what I observed." A tense silence followed his words. Officer Thompson's partner, whose nameplate identified him as Reynolds, had circled around to join his colleague. Both men's expressions shifted, but not in the way Langston had hoped. Instead of professional recognition, their faces darkened with something uglier. Well, Reynolds drawled, exchanging a look with his partner. "Looks like we got ourselves a real important man here, Thompson. A chief, he says." The mockery in his voice was unmistakable. Thompson leaned closer to the window, his breath heavy with the smell of mint, trying to mask something stronger. "I don't see no chief. All I see is someone interfering with police business. Last time I checked, Cedar Grove ain't got jurisdiction out here." Langston's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "This isn't about jurisdiction. This is about public safety and professional conduct. You're both clearly unfit for duty right now, and I'm offering you a chance to handle this the right way." "The right way?" Thompson's voice rose sharply. "You trying to tell us how to do our job?" His hand moved to rest on his belt, mirroring his partner's threatening posture. Langston's training screamed at him that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. He could see it in their aggressive stances, in the way they positioned themselves to block his car doors, in the growing hostility in their eyes. But he also saw something else, the deep-seated prejudice that no badge or rank could shield him from. "I'm going to reach for my credentials," Langston announced clearly, moving his right hand slowly toward the glove compartment. "Then we can discuss this properly." "Keep your hands where they are," Reynolds barked, fully unsnapping his holster. The situation had escalated from professional concern to personal danger in a matter of seconds. Langston's mind raced through his options, each one seeming worse than the last. He could feel decades of experience, warring with the basic instinct for survival. In that moment, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Langston realized this confrontation had become about something far more fundamental than drunk officers or professional courtesy. The dark highway was about to become a battlefield in a war he'd been fighting his entire career. A war between justice and prejudice, between the badge's true meaning and its abuse. And he was alone on the wrong side of the thin blue line. The metallic click of a handcuff ring striking Langston's driver's side window shattered the tense standoff. "Last warning," Thompson snarled. "Out of the car. Now." Langston knew the next few moments would determine everything. With deliberate slowness, he reached for his door handle, his other hand still visible on the steering wheel. "I'm complying," he announced clearly, "but I want both of you to know that everything you're doing is being recorded." It was a bluff. His dash cam was still packed in his vacation luggage, but it was a calculated risk. Thompson's face flickered with uncertainty for a split second before hardening again. As Langston stepped out of his car, his chief's badge caught the gleam of his car's interior light. The gold shield winked in the growing darkness, a symbol of authority that should have commanded respect. Instead, it seemed to fuel the officer's hostility. "Well, ain't that fancy?" Reynolds sneered, moving closer. "A real chief's badge. Bet that was real hard to come by." Langston stood at his full height, his bearing dignified despite the situation. 23 years of law enforcement experience radiated from his stance. "Officer Reynolds, Officer Thompson, I'm going to say this one more time. I'm Police Chief James Langston from Cedar Grove. My credentials are in my glove compartment. We can end this professionally, right here, right now." Thompson's laugh was ugly. "In what professionally? All I see is some guy with a fake badge trying to impersonate an officer." He stepped forward, invading Langston's personal space. "And that's a federal offense." "You know exactly who I am," Langston replied, his voice steady but firm. "And tomorrow morning when you're sober, you're going to realize just how badly you've miscalculated this situation." The mention of their intoxication struck a nerve. Reynolds' face contorted with rage. "You calling us drunk, boy?" The word hung in the air like poison. Langston had heard it countless times throughout his career, each instance carrying the weight of centuries of hatred. But hearing it from fellow officers, here and now, in 2024, sparked something deep inside him. "I'm calling you drunk, unprofessional, and a disgrace to the badge," Langston replied, each word precise and cutting. "And tomorrow, I'll be calling your superior officers." The first punch came from Thompson, a wild, rage-fueled swing that Langston managed to partially deflect. But Reynolds was already moving, and the fight erupted in earnest. Langston's training kicked in automatically. He blocked, dodged, and tried to create distance, but he was outnumbered and caught between his car and the two officers. "Not so high and mighty now, are you, Chief?" Thompson taunted, landing a solid blow to Langston's ribs. The sound of fabric tearing mixed with labored breathing and the scuff of boots on asphalt. Langston fought defensively, his movements measured and controlled even as the officers' attacks grew more frenzied. He could have matched their aggression, could have fought back with the full force of his capabilities, but something held him back. Maybe it was his position as chief. Maybe it was the knowledge that escalating the violence would only feed into their prejudices. Or maybe it was the sad recognition that this moment would define these officers' careers, and possibly his own. A sharp crack echoed through the night as Reynolds' baton connected with Langston's shoulder. The pain was immediate and intense, dropping him to one knee. Through blurred vision, he watched Thompson approach his car, keys jangling in his hand. "Let's see how the chief likes walking home," Thompson called out, the sound of scratching metal following his words as he dragged his keys along the length of Langston's car. As the red taillights disappeared around a bend, Langston slowly pushed himself up to sitting position. His phone lay shattered nearby, his car vandalized and disabled. But as he touched his chief's badge, still pinned to his chest despite the attack, a cold determination settled over him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The first blow came without warning, a savage punch that caught Langston in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Thompson followed through with a second strike while Reynolds circled behind, cutting off any chance of retreat. The attack was coordinated, practiced, suggesting this wasn't their first time assaulting an innocent civilian. "Stop," Langston commanded, his chief's voice cutting through the night air. "Think about what you're doing." He blocked Thompson's next punch, his defensive training kicking in automatically. But these weren't suspects he could subdue. These were fellow officers, and every option available to him carried impossible consequences. Reynolds' baton whistled through the air, forcing Langston to dodge awkwardly. "Not so professional now, are you, Chief?" The title became a slur in Reynolds' mouth as he pressed forward, forcing Langston back against his car. 23 years of law enforcement experience warred with basic survival instincts. Langston could have fought back. His training and physical condition would have given him a fair chance even against two opponents. But escalating the violence would only feed into their prejudices, confirm their twisted worldview. Yet each moment of restraint cost him dearly. "Officers, you're assaulting a fellow law enforcement official." Langston tried again, ducking under another wild swing. "This ends your careers. But we can still dash." Thompson's boot caught him in the knee, sending him stumbling. "Our careers?" The officer laughed, an ugly sound filled with malice. "Ain't nobody gonna believe you over us. Just another troublemaker resisting arrest." The fight shifted from professional restraint to pure survival as both officers pressed their advantage. Langston blocked what he could, absorbed what he couldn't, all while fighting the instinct to respond with equal force. His shoulder exploded in pain as Reynolds' baton found its mark, driving him to one knee. Through the haze of pain, Langston watched Thompson approach his car, keys glinting in the moonlight. The screech of metal on metal filled the air as the officer dragged his keys along the pristine paint, a deliberate act of destruction that seemed to give him perverse pleasure. "Let's make sure the chief can't follow us," Reynolds called out, moving toward the front of the vehicle. The sound of slashing tires followed, then the pop of the hood. More mechanical damage, ensuring Langston would be stranded. The assault continued with methodical cruelty. They destroyed his phone, scattered his belongings across the highway, and seemed to take particular satisfaction in ripping his chief's uniform. Through it all, Langston maintained his dignity, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing him beg or plead. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Thompson grabbed his partner's shoulder. "That's enough. Let's get out of here before someone drives by." Reynolds landed one final kick to Langston's ribs before retreating. "Remember this next time you think about playing chief outside your jurisdiction." Langston lay on the cold asphalt, listening to their cruiser's engine roar to life. The red taillights disappeared into the darkness, leaving him alone with his pain and the bitter taste of betrayal. But as he touched his badge, still pinned to his torn shirt, something hardened in his chest. These men hadn't just attacked him. They'd betrayed everything the badge represented. Every principle he'd spent his career upholding, every reform he'd fought to implement, every step forward in community relations had been thrown back in his face with their fists and batons. As he carefully cataloged his injuries and assessed his situation, Langston made a silent vow. This wouldn't be buried in paperwork or dismissed with paid leave. This night would mark the beginning of real change, no matter the cost. The badge they'd dishonored would become their undoing. The sound of the police cruiser faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of wind and Langston's labored breathing to break the night's silence. He remained on the ground for several long moments, the cold asphalt pressing against his cheek, each breath sending sharp pains through his ribcage. "Get up," he whispered to himself, the words tasting of copper. "Get up, James." The simple act of pushing himself to a sitting position became an exercise in willpower. His shoulders screamed in protest where Reynolds' baton had struck, and his ribs felt like they were wrapped in barbed wire. But it was the other pain, the one that had nothing to do with physical injuries, that threatened to overwhelm him. 23 years wearing the badge, 2 decades of building respect, breaking barriers, proving himself again and again. And in the end, none of it had mattered to those officers. They'd seen only what they wanted to see. Not a police chief, not a fellow officer, not even a human being deserving of basic dignity. Langston touched his face, fingers coming away wet with blood from a split lip. The metallic taste in his mouth brought back memories of his early days on the force, when he'd faced similar prejudices. But this was different. Those had been civilians, people who didn't know better. These were officers sworn to protect and serve. His car sat silent and useless beside him, its once pristine surface now carved with ugly scratches. The slashed tires and damaged engine ensured he wouldn't be driving out of this situation. His phone lay in pieces scattered across the asphalt, cutting off his connection to help, to Sarah, who would be wondering why he hadn't called to say he was running late. The temptation to give up, to let darkness claim this night as a victory, pressed down on him like a physical weight. It would be easier to let it go, to file a report that would disappear into the system, to accept this as just another reminder of how far they still had to go. But then his fingers brushed against his badge, still pinned to his torn shirt. The metal was cool against his skin, its weight familiar and grounding. In the dim moonlight, He could make out the words etched into its surface: to protect and serve. "Not today," Langston muttered, using his car door to pull himself to his feet. Not like this. The nearest town was 5 miles ahead, a daunting distance in his condition, but not impossible. Each movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but Langston forced himself to focus, to think like the officer he was. First priorities: assess the damage, salvage what he could, document everything. He retrieved his wallet from where it had fallen, gathered the pieces of his phone, evidence, all of it, and carefully folded his torn jacket. The night air had grown cool, but the walk would keep him warm. More importantly, it would keep him moving, keep him fighting. Looking up at the stars wheeling overhead, Langston thought about all the young officers he'd mentored, all the speeches he'd given about integrity and justice. What message would he send them if he let this pass? What example would he set if he chose the easy path over the right one? The first step toward town was the hardest. The second wasn't much easier. But by the third, Langston had found his rhythm, each footfall a silent promise. Thompson and Reynolds had meant to break him tonight, to remind him of his place in their world. Instead, they'd given him a new mission, a new purpose. As he walked into the gathering darkness, Langston began planning. He would need witnesses, documentation, support from other departments. The road ahead would be difficult, probably the hardest fight of his career. But he'd faced impossible odds before, and he was still standing. The badge that had made him a target would become his shield. The authority they disrespected would become their downfall. And this long walk in the darkness would become the first step toward a new kind of justice. Behind him, his car sat silent on the empty highway, its scratched surface catching the starlight like battle scars. Ahead, somewhere in the distance, lay the town and the beginning of his fight for accountability. Between them walked a man who had lost much tonight, but found something more valuable: an unshakable purpose. Each step along the darkened highway became its own battle. Langston's injured knee threatened to buckle with every footfall, while his bruised ribs made each breath a careful negotiation with pain. The moon cast enough light to navigate, but the shadows seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, marking the miles he still had to cover. "One step at a time," he muttered, falling back on the mantra that had carried him through his early days at the academy. Back then, he'd been the only black cadet in his class, fighting against prejudices both spoken and unspoken. Now, decades later, he was still fighting the same battle, just wearing different stripes. His mind drifted to a case from his second year as a patrol officer. A young black teenager, wrongfully arrested, had filed a complaint about excessive force. Langston had testified on the boy's behalf, breaking the unwritten code of silence. The repercussions had followed him for years: cold shoulders, missed promotions, random, schedule changes. But that teenager had gone on to become a lawyer, dedicated to police reform. Sometimes, Langston reminded himself, the price was worth paying. Another memory surfaced: his first day as chief, standing before his officers. "Change starts with us," he'd told them. Some had nodded, others had stared blank-faced, and a few, including Thompson and Reynolds, had barely hidden their contempt. He should have seen this coming, should have recognized the danger they represented. The pain in his shoulder flared as he adjusted his torn jacket. Evidence, he reminded himself, mentally cataloging everything he could remember about the assault. The angle of the strikes suggested Reynolds was right-handed. Thompson had smelled of whiskey, cheap whiskey, probably from the flask he'd seen protruding from the officer's back pocket. Details mattered. Details would build his case. A car approached from behind, its headlights painting his shadow across the asphalt. Langston moved further onto the shoulder, but didn't turn or wave. The vehicle slowed briefly. He could feel the driver's curious gaze, but continued on. Better that way. His appearance would raise too many questions, and he needed time to think, to plan. His phone might be destroyed, but he remembered their unit number, 247. Their name tags had been clearly visible: Thompson, J, and Reynolds, M. Their arrogance had made them careless, confident in their immunity. That same arrogance would be their undoing. As he walked, Langston began constructing his strategy. First, he'd need medical documentation of his injuries, photographs, x-rays, official reports, then statements, as many as he could gather. The gas station attendant who'd seen them drinking, the dispatcher who'd logged their location. Every piece would matter. But this couldn't just be about one incident, one night, two officers. The system that had produced Thompson and Reynolds, that had made them feel untouchable, needed to be dismantled. Sensitivity training and diversity workshops weren't enough. They needed fundamental change, starting with recruitment and extending through every level of law enforcement. A memory of his grandfather surfaced, bringing unexpected strength. The old man had marched for civil rights, facing dogs and fire hoses with quiet dignity. Change ain't never come easy, he used to say, but it always comes to those who keep walking. Tonight, those words carried new meaning. The pain had settled into a steady rhythm now, becoming almost meditative. Each step brought him closer to town, closer to justice, closer to turning this night of humiliation into a catalyst for reform. Thompson and Reynolds had meant to break him, to remind him of his place in their world. Instead, they'd given him a mission. In the distance, the first lights of town began to appear, a constellation of possibility growing brighter with each step. Langston straightened his back, ignoring the protest of his injuries. The physical evidence of their assault would fade. The bruises would heal, the cuts would close, but what remained would be far more dangerous to them. His resolve. He began mentally drafting his report, each detail sharp and clear in his mind. This wouldn't be buried in bureaucracy or dismissed with paid leave. This would be the case that forced his department and others to confront the cancer growing within their ranks. The badge that had made him a target would become a spotlight, illuminating the darkness they thought would protect them. And this long walk, this painful journey through the night, would become the first steps toward lasting change. Ahead, the town's lights grew stronger, pushing back the darkness. Langston allowed himself a grim smile. Thompson and Reynolds thought they'd left him broken on that highway. Instead, they'd helped forge something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The fluorescent lights of the Millbrook police station cast harsh shadows across Langston's battered face as he pushed through the glass doors. The night shift dispatcher, Jenny Martinez, looked up from her computer screen, her practiced greeting dying on her lips as she took in his appearance. "Chief Langston?" Her hand instinctively moved toward the radio. "Sir, you need medical?" "Not yet." His voice carried the weight of command despite his condition. "Get Sergeant Walsh and Lieutenant Rivera in here. Now." The squad room erupted into motion. Officers who had been lounging over paperwork straightened, their expressions shifting from shock to confusion to something darker as they processed the implications of their chief's condition. Langston noted each reaction, mentally cataloging allies and potential obstacles. Officer Chen was already on the phone, his low voice urgent as he contacted Walsh. Rookie Officer Patterson hovered uncertainly by the coffee machine, his young face a mirror of the department's conscience. And in the corner, Detective Morris carefully closed a folder and moved closer, positioning himself between Langston and the door. Protection, not containment. "Sir," Morris spoke quietly, "Thompson and Reynolds are still on patrol. Their last check-in was Unit 247, 20 minutes ago, heading east on County Line Road." Langston finished, his words precise and measured. "I know exactly where they are, and I know exactly what they've done." Sergeant Walsh burst through the side door, his massive frame filling the doorway. The veteran officer took one look at Langston and his face darkened with understanding. Behind him, Lieutenant Rivera appeared, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "I want them brought in," Langston stated, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "But this needs to be done by the book. Everything documented, everything witnessed, everything perfect." Rivera moved to her computer terminal, fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm pulling their dashcam footage now, and the GPS logs." "They disabled their cameras," Langston said with certainty. "Check the maintenance logs. I bet they reported technical issues at the start of their shift." Walsh's hand tightened on his belt. "You want me to bring them in myself, Chief?" "No." Langston straightened despite the pain. "Send Sean and Morris. Thompson and Reynolds will be expecting retaliation. They won't be prepared for procedure." The room had taken on the focused energy of a coming storm. Officers moved with purpose, radios crackled with coded messages, and printers hummed with warrant paperwork. But Langston could feel the undercurrents, the shock, the anger, and from some corners, the fear of change to come. "Martinez," he called to the dispatcher, "I need you to contact state police. This investigation needs external oversight. And get me Judge Henderson's home number." "Sir," Patterson spoke up, his rookie courage pushing through protocol, "shouldn't you let medical check you out first?" Langston met the young officer's concerned gaze. "Soon. But first, we do this right. Those officers didn't just assault their chief tonight. They attacked everything that badge represents, and we're going to make it right." Rivera approached with a tablet displaying Thompson and Reynolds' personnel files. "Their disciplinary records have been sanitized," she reported, professional anger evident in her tone. "Multiple complaints disappeared from the system." "Document everything," Langston ordered. "Every deleted file, every changed date, every altered record. The cover-up ends tonight." Walsh returned from the armory with tactical gear. "Sean and Morris are ready to roll. SWAT's on standby." "No SWAT," Langston countermanded. "We do this clean. By the book. Give them no excuses, no claims of excessive force. Just the weight of the law they swore to uphold." The radio crackled with Unit 247's routine check-in. Thompson's voice, slightly slurred but confident, filled the room. They had no idea what was coming. Their world of impunity was about to shatter. Langston moved to the center of the squad room, his presence commanding attention despite his injuries. "Listen up. What happens tonight will define this department for years to come. We can either be the force that cleaned its own house, or the one that looked the other way. I know where I stand. Each of you needs to decide where you stand." The room responded with determined nods and straightened backs. Even those who had been uncertain seemed to draw strength from their chief's resolve. "Chan Morris," Langston addressed the arrest team. "Bring them in. By the book. No mistakes. No excuses." As the officers filed out, Langston finally allowed himself to sink into a chair. The adrenaline was wearing off, making way for exhaustion and pain. But his mind remained sharp, focused on the storm about to break. Thompson and Reynolds had tried to teach him a lesson tonight. Instead, they were about to learn one themselves. Justice doesn't wear a color, and the law doesn't bow to prejudice. The gathering storm was about to break. The night shift's usual quiet was shattered by the coordinated movement of police units converging on their targets. Detective Morris's voice crackled over the secure channel. "Unit 247 last spotted heading toward Carson County line. All units be advised. Suspects are considered armed and dangerous." From his position in the command center, Langston watched the GPS markers move across the digital map. Thompson and Reynolds had realized something was wrong when their routine check-in was met with an order to return to the station immediately. Their response, burning rubber in the opposite direction, said everything about their guilt. "Chief," Lieutenant Rivera called from her station, "you need to see this." Her computer screen displayed a cascade of incident reports, each bearing a familiar pattern. "We found 17 similar complaints in the past year alone. All minorities, all during night shifts, all mysteriously resolved without investigation." Langston's jaw tightened. How many were buried? "That's the thing," Rivera's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Someone tried to delete these records, but IT keeps encrypted backups. The system logs show unauthorized access from..." She paused, her expression hardening. "Internal Affairs Lieutenant Davidson's terminal." The pieces were falling into place. Davidson had always resisted Langston's reforms, always found reasons to dismiss minority complaints. Now they knew why. The phone lines were lighting up as news of the manhunt spread. Local media had caught wind of the story. 2 officers fleeing, a police chief assaulted, allegations of systematic racism. But the surprise came from other quarters. "Chief," Martinez called out, "we've got 3 officers from Carson County PD requesting to join the search. They say Thompson and Reynolds did the same thing in their jurisdiction last year. The victims were too scared to press charges." More calls came in. A state trooper who'd witnessed suspicious behavior but been warned to stay quiet. a former rookie who transferred after trying to report them. Even Judge Henderson, known for his conservative views, called to express his outrage and offer his full support. "They're heading for the old Miller property," Sergeant Walsh announced, studying the terrain map. "That access road leads to the state line." Langston nodded. "They think they can make it to Mitchell County. Their uncle's a deputy there." He keyed the radio. "All units, be advised. Suspects are likely armed and may have backup waiting. Cheon, Morris, coordinate with state police for roadblocks. I want that road sealed." The media had gathered outside the station, their camera lights creating artificial day in the parking lot. Langston could see the headlines already. "Police chief attacked by own officers. Racial tension erupts in police force. Systemic racism exposed." But this wasn't about headlines. This was about justice. "Got them." Chen's voice burst through the radio. "Visual confirmation on Unit 247. They've turned onto Miller Road." There. A burst of static. "They're not stopping." Attempting to ram the roadblock. The command center held its breath. The sound of screeching tires came through the radio, followed by a tremendous crash. "Suspect's vehicle has hit the barrier," Morris reported, his voice steady. "No injuries. Thompson and Reynolds are..." A pause. "They're surrendering. We have them in custody." A collective exhale filled the room. But Langston knew this was just the beginning. The real work, cleaning house, exposing the cover-ups, rebuilding trust, was still ahead. "Sir," Rivera approached with a fresh report, "Davidson just tried to access the system remotely. IT tracked the attempt." "Get me a warrant," Langston ordered. "We're not just taking down 2 officers. We're taking down the whole corrupt system." Outside, the media lights continued to flash, illuminating the station like a lightning storm. But inside, in the quiet efficiency of the command center, justice was already moving forward. Thompson and Reynolds were just the first drops of rain. The real storm was yet to come. As if to emphasize the point, Martinez's voice cut through the moment. "Chief, the FBI Civil Rights Division is on line 1. They want to talk about opening a formal investigation." Langston allowed himself a grim smile. Thompson and Reynolds had wanted to teach him about power tonight. Instead, they were about to learn about justice. Real justice. Blind justice. The kind that didn't care what color you were or what badge you wore. The kind that was long overdue. The morning sun streamed through the blinds of the conference room, illuminating the tense faces of Millbrook's command staff. Lieutenant Davidson sat at the far end, his usual swagger replaced by barely concealed anxiety. The arrest of Thompson and Reynolds had triggered a landslide, and the ground beneath their feet was still shifting. "This is a witch hunt," Davidson declared, throwing a stack of personnel files onto the table. "You're going to destroy department morale over one isolated incident." Langston, his injuries still visible but his voice steady, leaned forward. "Isolated? Like these 17 complaints that disappeared from our system? Or the dozen cases from Carson County? Or should we talk about the encrypted files on your personal drive?" The room grew silent. Several sergeants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but others, including Walsh and Rivera, sat straighter, their expressions hardening with resolve. "Chief," Captain Martinez spoke up, surprising everyone. The usually quiet administrator had been with the department for 20 years. I need to show you something." She pulled out a worn notebook. "I've been keeping records. Dates, times, cases that got buried. I should have spoken up sooner, but the blue wall was too high," Langston finished softly. "That wall comes down today." Outside the conference room, the department was transforming. Officer Chen had organized a group of younger officers to review old complaints, looking for patterns. Detective Morris was coordinating with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, providing years of meticulously kept personal notes. Even Patterson, the rookie, had convinced 3 former officers to come forward with testimonies. The phone on the conference table buzzed. "Chief," the dispatcher's voice came through, "Reverend Jackson and the Community Oversight Committee are here. And sir, they brought nearly 200 supporters." Langston moved to the window. The crowd outside wasn't angry or violent. They were standing in silent solidarity, holding signs that read, "Support Chief Langston," and reform now. Among them, he recognized faces from every part of the community: business owners, teachers, other law enforcement officers, and citizens of all backgrounds. This isn't about destroying the department, Langston addressed the room. This is about saving it. Every officer who abuses power, every complaint that gets buried, every incident we ignore, they all chip away at the foundation of trust we're supposed to build. He activated the projector, displaying a series of new policies on the screen. Effective immediately, body cameras will be mandatory and cannot be deactivated during shifts. All civilian complaints will be reviewed by an independent board. Training protocols will be overhauled, with emphasis on de-escalation and cultural competency. Davidson snorted. You can't implement these changes without board approval. Actually, he can, Rivera interjected, sliding forward a document bearing the mayor's signature. Emergency powers granted under Article 7, following evidence of systematic misconduct. The city council voted unanimously this morning. The changes weren't just on paper. Throughout the station, officers were already adapting. The old break room, once segregated by unofficial custom, now hosted mixed groups discussing reform ideas. Veterans who had initially resisted change were being won over by younger officers' enthusiasm and dedication. I've got the FBI on line 1, Walsh announced from the doorway. They want to know if we need additional support for the investigation. Langston surveyed the room, noting who met his gaze and who looked away. Tell them yes. We're not just cleaning house, we're rebuilding from the foundation up. A young officer burst in, slightly out of breath. Chief, you need to see this. Other departments are calling. They want to know about our new protocols. They're saying this could be a model for national reform. The weight of that possibility settled over the room. What had started as an assault on a dark highway was becoming something much larger. A catalyst for change that could reach far beyond Millbrook's borders. Here's what happens next, Langston addressed the command staff. Those who want to be part of the solution, stay. Those who don't. He let the silence finish his sentence. Davidson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he dropped his badge on the table and walked out. 2 other officers followed. But for every officer who left, 3 stepped forward. Walsh began outlining new patrol protocols. Rivera presented plans for community engagement initiatives. Martinez shared her documentation system for tracking complaints and responses. Outside, the crowd had begun to sing, an old civil rights anthem that floated through the windows. Inside, the work of real change was already underway. The blue wall wasn't just breaking. It was being transformed into a bridge. The courthouse steps were crowded as Thompson and Reynolds emerged in handcuffs, their former swagger replaced by defeated slouches. The federal prosecutor's words still echoed in the chamber, guilty on all counts. Behind them, Lieutenant Davidson and 3 other officers faced their own reckonings, their plea deals contingent on full cooperation with the ongoing investigation. Langston watched from his office window, absently touching the nearly healed scar above his eye. The physical wounds had mended faster than the emotional ones, but both were healing. The past 3 months had transformed not just him, but the entire department. Chief, Officer Patterson knocked on the door frame. The new training instructors are here, and that consultant from the Civil Rights Division wants to review the community oversight protocols. The department's training room had been completely redesigned. Gone were the old-school lectures about authority and control. In their place, scenarios emphasized de-escalation, cultural competency, and community engagement. On the walls, screens displayed real-time body camera feeds. Transparency was no longer optional but fundamental. "I never thought I'd see this," Sergeant Walsh commented, watching a group of officers practicing meditation techniques with a trauma specialist. "But I've had fewer complaints in the last month than in any year I can remember." The changes weren't just internal. Every Wednesday evening, the Community Oversight Board met in the station's largest conference room. Tonight, Reverend Jackson sat beside local business owners, civil rights attorneys, and concerned citizens, reviewing body camera footage and policy proposals. Their discussions were sometimes heated, often challenging, but always productive. "The statistics are encouraging," Lieutenant Rivera reported, spreading charts across Langston's desk. Use of force incidents down 60%. Civilian complaints reduced by half. And our minority recruitment has tripled. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real changes were visible in daily interactions. Officers chatting with neighborhood kids, community members bringing homemade lunches to the station, former critics becoming allies in reform. Chief Martinez appeared at the door. "There's someone here to see you." The visitor was unexpected. Officer Thompson's teenage son, Marcus. The boy stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching a notebook. "I'm doing a school project," he said quietly, "about changing things that are wrong. I wondered if you talked to my class about what happened, about making things right." Langston felt the weight of the moment. "Sit down, Marcus. Let's talk about change." As they spoke, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office. Outside, a new crop of recruits, the most diverse in department history, practiced community policing scenarios in the parking lot. Their instructor, a reformed veteran officer who had once resisted change, now preached the gospel of transformation. The healing wasn't just departmental. Langston had started attending a support group for officers affected by violence, learning that vulnerability could coexist with strength. His story had become a catalyst, inspiring other departments to confront their own demons. "We've got visitors again," Walsh announced later that day. 3 chiefs from upstate. They want to study our reforms." Langston nodded, remembering his own journey from victim to catalyst to leader. The department's new motto, painted prominently in the lobby, said it all: protect, serve, transform. The old guard was giving way to a new vision of policing. Davidson's office, once a symbol of resistance, now housed the Community Relations Division. Thompson and Reynolds' former patrol area had become a model for community-oriented policing. As the day wound down, Langston stood in the parking lot where, months ago, he had stumbled in bloody and determined. Now, officers ending their shifts exchanged friendly waves with passing residents. A group of kids played basketball in the newly installed community court beside the station. "You know what the best part is?" Rivera said, joining him. "It's not just policy changes. People's hearts are changing." Langston watched a rookie officer help an elderly woman with her groceries. No cameras around, no obligation. Just humanity in action. "The seeds we planted," he replied, "they're growing into something bigger than us." That evening, as he prepared for another community meeting, Langston caught his reflection in the window. The scars were still visible, but they no longer defined him. They were reminders of where he'd been, signposts on the road to where they were going. The department was changing. The community was healing. And in the end, that's what justice looked like. Not just punishment for the guilty, but transformation for all. The seeds of change had taken root, and spring was just beginning. The morning sun painted Millbrook's police station in shades of gold, catching the newly installed community garden where roses and hope grew in equal measure. Chief James Langston paused at the entrance, as he did every morning, to appreciate how much had changed in 6 months. Where once stood imposing security barriers, now sat comfortable benches where officers and citizens chatted over morning coffee. The station's walls, previously stark and institutional, displayed artwork from local schools alongside photographs of community events. Even the air felt different, lighter, more welcoming. "Morning, Chief," called Mrs. Rodriguez from the newly established community relations desk. The Youth Council left their proposal for the summer outreach program, and the FBI just sent their final report. "We're officially a model department for reform." Langston smiled, remembering the long journey here. The physical scars had faded to barely visible lines, but their lessons remained etched in the department's new foundations. Inside his office, the morning briefing painted a picture of transformation. Lieutenant Rivera, now heading internal affairs, reported record-high satisfaction rates from both officers and civilians. The mandatory body camera program had resulted in a 90% reduction in use of force complaints, and officer morale had actually improved with the increased transparency. "Remember how Davidson used to say accountability would destroy morale?" Sergeant Walsh chuckled, reviewing the latest statistics. "Turns out, good cops love working in a department they can be proud of." The changes went beyond numbers. Every officer now underwent monthly cultural competency training, with programs designed by community leaders and civil rights experts. The Citizen Oversight Board had evolved into a true partnership, their recommendations helping shape everything from patrol strategies to hiring practices. "Chief," Officer Patterson interrupted, barely containing his excitement. "The Academy just called. Our new recruitment program? 30% women, 40% minorities. It's the most diverse class in state history." Langston followed him to the training room, where the walls now bore the department's new core values: integrity, empathy, growth, community. The old shoot-don't-shoot scenarios had been replaced with complex simulations emphasizing de-escalation and cultural awareness. In the break room, veterans and rookies shared lunch together, the old hierarchical divisions dissolved by shared purpose. Officer Chin was explaining community policing techniques to new recruits, while Detective Morris led a discussion on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. "You should see this, sir," Martinez called from dispatch, holding up a letter. "Thompson wrote from prison. He's been doing counseling, wants to speak to academy classes about where he went wrong. Says he finally understands what you were trying to build here." Outside, the community garden hosted a meeting between officers and local youth leaders, planning the upcoming police community basketball tournament. The event had become a symbol of their new relationship, competitive but collaborative, focused on building connections rather than asserting authority. Later that afternoon, Langston stood before a gathering of police chiefs from across the country, sharing Millbrook's journey. "The hardest walls to break," he told them, "aren't made of brick and mortar. They're built from fear, prejudice, and the comfort of the status quo. But once they fall, you discover they were holding everyone prisoner, not just those on the outside." The evidence of change was everywhere. Former critics now served as department advisors. Officers who had initially resisted reform now led training sessions. The thin blue line had transformed from a barrier into a bridge, connecting rather than dividing. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Langston confided to Rivera as they watched the sunset from the station roof. "It's not the awards or the recognition. It's that young officers like Patterson can't even imagine policing any other way. This is their normal now." Below them, the evening shift changed over. Officers greeted community members by name. Patrol cars carried youth council members on ride-alongs, and the station doors remained symbolically and literally open to all. The night brought its own testament to change. The same street where Langston had once faced hatred now hosted a community night walk, officers and residents together reclaiming their streets from fear. In his final log entry that evening, Langston wrote, "6 months ago, 2 officers tried to teach me about power. Instead, they helped us all learn about transformation. Their violence planted seeds of change that grew into something they never intended. A department worthy of its badge, a community healing its wounds, and a future built on trust rather than fear." He paused, looking out at the city he served, before adding, "This isn't the end of our journey. It's just the beginning of a new dawn." Outside his window, the garden's roses bloomed under the station's lights, their petals open to tomorrow's promise.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.